This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Hi, so welcome back to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm your host, Dr. Jabari Evans, Assistant Professor of Race and Media here at the University of South Carolina. And I'm here with Geoff Harkness, Associate Professor of Sociology at Rhode Island College. And we, before getting on air, we're just talking about some of the spaces and places we were familiar with in Chicago. And then also like the serendipity of the fact that we both have PhDs from Northwestern, yet we're like two ships in the night and didn't really touch base. But I think the uniting force of hip hop is one that is always going to sort of bring those who are thinkers together. And, you know, I was telling him that for my dissertation, his work set the stage for me to really understand how to sort of merge hip hop scenes or micro scenes, as he calls them, with sort of the practice of ethnography and what that looks like when it's done well. And so I was giving him his flowers. You know, that's something hip hop tends to do these days. And so I just want to welcome you to the pod. How are you doing, man?
I'm great. Thank you. That's super kind. I really appreciate that. And I think it was Kwame Harrison's work that did the same thing for me. I read his book, Hip Hop Underground, and I went, oh, this is how you do this. And that's when I wrote Hustle and Flow. It was when I read his book that I went, the same thing you were sort of saying, now I understand how to take everything I was doing and seeing and observing and putting it into something that looks like this. And so his book was absolutely just the roadmap for me. And so I appreciate that comment, because it's nice that I could do that for someone else and sort of pass that along from Kwame.
That's so hip hop that, like, you know, there's like a lineage of people reading work, sampling and remixing, reimagining, right? Kwame's work, I found like articles where he was talking about being in the Bay and being an artist himself and like doing auto ethnography. And so I didn't end up kind of going that route, but like I definitely got exposed to sort of his work a little down the line. I feel like when I was in grad school, I was trying to like really make sure I read every single thing. And I guess that's what that time is for. You know, I think for sure the familiarity of hearing like, oh, I was hanging out around Double Door or, you know, Subterranean or wherever, or U.S. Beer Company, all those like names definitely lit up, you know, light bulbs in my head, because I'm like, oh, I was like, I might even ran into this guy, you know, like during this time, or some of the names that were coming up. I was like, oh man, this is super dope. So, I mean, I hope that my work at some point may, you know, do the same for someone else. But I think that it's almost like a fraternity. And I think I was talking to Murray Foreman about this, is that, you know, he was telling me, he said, if you're around long enough in this, you'll become a historian. And I was like, well, I can only hope that at some point, you know, I have a certain level of wisdom to be considered a historian. But for those of the listeners that are not familiar with Chicago Hustle and Flow, it explores the connections between gangs, gangster rap, and social class. What sort of led you to this investigation, and what were the key findings from that book?
Well, I got to Chicago in 2003, and I mean, it's interesting because the Devious Minds project precedes everything that happened in Chicago, and ultimately, the book that I just came out with is what led me to Chicago Hustle and
It's
Flow.
so
Although it's kind of
interesting to get
out of
that
order.
retroactively.
Yes, yeah, right. People always ask, like, how did you end up, on the front porch of Habit's front porch in Chicago? Like, how did you get there? And I thought, boy, there's a whole story here you don't know. But yeah, I got to Chicago, and at that point, I had been working as a music journalist for several years, and managed to get a job at the Chicago Tribune doing music journalism for them while I was at Northwestern. So I was sort of in heaven because I'm working as a music journalist, and at a place like the Tribune, you can get good stories. They actually, Kanye West, I interviewed him, was my first interview I did for them. Wow. So I was writing for them, and I really wanted to fuse music and sociology. My master's thesis was about pawn shops, which was not music related, but I really wanted to explore those two worlds and bring them together. So I thought that I was just going to do this sort of project for a class and a video project, but ultimately, I just realized that that's kind of where my heart was, and I felt like I had to make a film about it too. So I did make a documentary film about the underground rap music scene in Chicago. And it was really that video camera that gave me a role and a reason to be out there in the clubs videotaping. And I became known as the video guy. Oh, this is a guy, this documentary film. And ultimately, I was posting that footage on YouTube, and people got to know me through that and wanted to be part of this project. So ultimately, through meeting people and doing this documentary film, after several years of doing interviews, going to all the different clubs, going to recording sessions and things like that, I was already writing about things. So my first topic was white rappers. I wanted to understand how white rappers negotiated their racial identity within a culture that deemed them inauthentic. So I started there, but it very quickly got on to Latino rappers, because also they held this sort of position sort of in between. Kwame Harrison writes about the racial hierarchies within rap music. And so Latino rappers also had this sort of liminal position that I thought was interesting, because they were sort of above whites in the racial hierarchy, but below others. And so I was working with kind of both of those ideas, and I got onto the backpacker gangster thing also. I was interested in social class, and really the project itself, what you see in Hustle and Flow, is such a small slice of this bigger project that included, places like the Subterranean and, Verbal Kent and Rusty Chains and Typical Cats. I got to throw some names out there for you, and just going to some of these spaces and oh my gosh, West Restless. I mean, the names start to come back. So going to those spaces, and I was studying a lot more than just certainly the gangs. What happened though is, after several years of being involved in these different micro scenes and getting to know all of these different people who were involved in the music scene, some of them were clearly involved in gangs. And at this point, I knew them well enough, or got to kind of know them well enough, that I was able to start interviewing them and asking them questions more specifically about their gang involvement, just because at this point I knew them well enough to feel comfortable doing that. But this then led to what happens in Hustle and Flow, which is that I was so embedded within this world that is called Fantastic in the book. But when he passed away, I had just videotaped his last performance. I mean, his final performance ever, like a week before this happened. And also I had amassed tons of videotape of him and the group playing. And so having that footage, I think, was really, you're talking about being a historian and how important this footage has become, and the footage of Devious Minds. And, now I have this hip hop footage that when I was shooting, videotapes of like hip hop culture in Topeka in 1999, nobody thought that was very interesting, but it sure seems interesting today, doesn't it? All this footage of Chicago hip hop clubs, filmed with like a really good camera in 2003, 20 years ago. Suddenly it becomes more interesting. So
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm like rambling on, but
Oh
the
no.
game,
Oh no. No. No.
it
No.
was very sort of organic. I was able to then start asking deliberately about that, and as I got more and
Mm,
more into that, the ability to sort of ask about that and get involved in that world made me want to know more about it. And then
mhm.
also all of these feuds sort of broke out too. And some of the groups that I was very close with started feuding with each other. And then I was also, sort of very much involved because I was making this film. And so
Right.
I was the music scene, but I was certainly involved in this. And we did have a premiere for the film that was absolutely incredible. It was at the Portage Theater, and
That's
showed the
dope.
movie. I think 300 or 400 people came to it. Everyone in the film, all their families, all their friends. It was one of the most incredible nights of my entire life. Having all the people from that research project in one room together, watching this movie together. No fights, nothing like that. It was great. So.
Man, I'm wondering. There's two things as you were talking, it sort of popped in my head. The first is like I think sometimes timing and luck often plays into what we have access to.
Yeah.
Very similarly to I think the era and time you're talking about in Chicago is one where I think Chicago as a scene in the rap music game was still finding itself, yet was still so abundant with talent. And,
Yes. Oh man.
to really have that access at that point was what I would imagine was a sociologist's dream. All these different personalities from these different sectors of the city, gathering at spaces on a very regular basis where you can say, oh, okay, I know they're going to be here and I can get in and I can do this and have, the data. I hate calling it that, but like have the amount of richness to the project that's going to, allow you a gold mine, to go through. I think for me, and even being in graduate school at a very particular time, actually living in Hyde Park, I made connections with Forrest Stewart, who was doing a project on drill rap that eventually
Mm-hmm.
becomes Ballad of the Bullet. But he
Yep.
needed like intel on scenes and how to maneuver certain neighborhoods, and then he was like, "Hey, would you like to help me?" And so, I think me having conversations with him gave me sort of the thought process that the work that I was doing in Chicago public schools and being around very young artists who were interested in doing drill, couple that with like Web 2.0, which I think is the continuation of Chicago Hustle and Flow, is the reason I think Chicago's scene, as disparate as it was during that time, becomes far more connected through social media and people like Andrew Barber and Fake Shore Drive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I look at all of that as luck, in terms of like, yeah, to have the ability to analyze it is one thing, but like, you know, in reading your book, I was on the backpack side of things, and you didn't have, access to the other side, or they looked at you one way. And, it was through working in Chicago public schools, really, that I had access to that end of it, right? I would never have had access to it if I came in as who I was as an artist. It was my
Mm-hmm.
authenticity came from the space of he's in this neighborhood every day going to these schools, and these kids are
Mm-hmm.
just are graduating, and this is just who they're listening to. I'm just paying attention to what's on their phones and what's on their computers, and I'm doing what I would consider now to be a mixed method of digital ethnography or digital urban
Right.
ethnography. What is it that continually makes Chicago such a rich scene to visit for sociologists and sociological work?
Well, I mean, it has that history. It's always been a
Yeah, I
city
mean it
that's
does, but
right.
it stands true, and I just wonder. I'm from there.
Yes.
I'm biased, so I'm always going to have my own opinions. But I wonder
Yeah.
what you think about that, and just the idea that as an exemplar of like a centralized city, why Chicago tends to be able to unearth these types of stories.
Yeah, well, I think it was so exciting moving there and going to study and be an ethnographer in Chicago. I mean, it was such an exciting time just to get, go there. I think, part of it is that it's not on a coast, it is central, and so it doesn't have that, sort of coastal influence. It's more of a bit more of a melting pot in the center. But it's a big city. So unlike, Omaha or something, which
Hmm.
has a cool music scene, it's, the size of Chicago makes it very unique. And so when I got there, I was living in Kansas City and Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence,
Hmm.
Kansas is a college town, but it has a
Yeah.
really big music scene and there's music stuff happening there all the time.
Yeah.
Going to Chicago, it was incredible how many things were happening every single night of the week. I
Hmm.
could go to something every night of the week that was related, specifically devoted to rap music or hip hop culture. That
Right.
was definitely not true in Lawrence, Kansas. And so the size of Chicago, I think, helped. And then also demographically, it was interesting because you have this split of like almost an equal number, at least when I was there studying, of
Hmm.
Black, white, and Latino
Yeah.
populations. And also that was true within rap music too. And so,
Yep.
like Kwame Harrison's work really had, was influenced by the demographics of the Bay Area. And I think Hustle and Flow
Hmm.
very much by Chicago. That's why there's so many Latino rappers in there because, and also white rappers. It was like there
Hmm.
was an abundance of,
Oh yeah.
these different groups who were involved in it. And so to me, that really helped the project because it was sort of unique. I was looking at all of these, Colleen Neff's work and all of these
Yeah.
other, um, you know, uh, Morgan's work in Los Angeles, all of the
Hmm.
different, ethnographies of rap, and trying to find like what's distinct here. And
Hmm.
and it really was kind of unique in that sense. But for me, what was so great was just the ability to go out every single night of the week and find stuff to do with no problem at all. And it was the at the very beginnings of social media that enabled that too, because I was on
Right.
MySpace at the time, going back
Yes.
to MySpace, all the MySpace rappers. And one of the maybe the distinctions about the project that I was doing is to be part of the project, you had to be performing in clubs live.
Hmm.
That I didn't want anybody who was like a bedroom
Just a
rapper
studio
making,
rapper. Yeah.
which now, like, that's kind of where the scene is. It's moved into those digital spaces, those virtual spaces. But for
Sure
me,
has.
you couldn't be part of the project unless you were performing live, because I wanted to go film those same artists, and videotape them performing live as well
Right.
as interview them. So I couldn't just do it with somebody in their bedroom studio. I had to have them performing too. And so I really started in the clubs. That project for me always began in the clubs. Every time
Mm.
I recruited somebody for the project, it was because I saw them live and they blew me away. And then I went and
Right.
introduced myself and said, let's get involved. So it's interesting how that changed when social media came along, when YouTube came along, when the ability, Chief Keef, the ability to make it on your videos that
Yes.
filmed in your backyard in your bedroom.
Yes.
That was a sea change that was very different. And in some ways, Hustle and Flow took place at the sort of maybe what was the last of that sort of era where you had to be out performing live in clubs. And that also created the problems with the gangs because,
Right.
of course, you're announcing when you're going to be
Yep.
performing and what the address is and all of that. So,
Yeah. 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 No, I think the thing that you hit upon, which is sort of the second thing I was thinking about, is like authenticity. Like, how do you achieve that? And you're
yeah.
right. Like at the time when, you know, even when I was sort of in high school, I remember, my older cousin Corey, who was in a group called the Mole Men, and he
I
was
know them.
working with Rhyme Fest at the time, who was his best friend from elementary school. Rhyme Fest, of course, has gone on to do pretty big things, win Grammys, so on and so forth, work with Kanye.
Hmm.
But I remember talking to Rhyme Fest, and his thing, as well as my cousin's thing, was like, it doesn't matter what kind of rapper you are. Like, if you can't get on that stage in certain venues and not get booed, then Chicago won't respect you.
Yeah.
And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that authenticity, even if you did go to some of these open mics and get booed, there was a thought of at least you went out there, like we saw him,
Paid your dues. Yeah. Hmm.
right? And I think the transition to someone being able to prove their authenticity coming from their curation of content online, is that's when the things started to change, and then the cameramen became very important in another way, where it turned
Mm-hmm.
from performances and video of being at a show to video of lifestyle content. I was thinking as you were talking, like, often I think we get out of the way of this multimodal viewpoint of analysis in academia. Um, do you do you think that we should sort of change the ways in which we think about um, the written article or the book being sort of the definitive uh, product that sort of kind of puts a stamp on the work that we've done, or what it's considered to be rigorous? Because I feel like
Yeah.
more and more specifically, in a field, I'm in communication studies and media studies, but I think in all spaces in which ethnography is being performed, I think you're dealing with folks whose everyday lives are so inhabited with media that how can we then talk about their lives or even communicate, what we've seen or been immersed in uh, strictly through the written word? Do you think that maybe, I think often creative scholarship is given like a back seat to sort of, again, the book or the journal article.
Yeah.
Um, do you think that, maybe this the documentary or even the space for the more visual experience could be a part of the canon in a way that maybe it hasn't been up till now?
Well, if someone's able to, uh, break through and figure out how to do it, then let me know, because others have tried, I've tried,
Yeah.
but the academia is very conservative in terms of its methodology. I think sociology is more conservative than
Yes.
even communications, and so I've
Mm-hmm.
always had a very difficult time with my use of video, which has been central. My pawn shops project, I did a documentary film about pawn shops as well.
Mm.
And, to me, I always had to write stuff to justify using the video. And it was
Of course.
I always had to present it as sort of this accompaniment. And
Mm-hmm.
people always liked it when I, take that material to conferences and stuff like that. They always
Mm-hmm.
enjoy watching it, and it's cool. But, yeah, it's always been difficult to get it taken seriously. And,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, certainly I'm not going to be the person to change that, but somebody have tried to change that. And for some
Yeah.
reason, it's always been a barrier. I mean, I've tried to get, my hip hop stuff played at ASA conferences and stuff, and they're just not interested. So
Mm.
it's hard to say. I don't know what, how to do that. It's cool to see things like podcasts and other
Mm-hmm.
spaces open up where you can have, alternative discussions, and certainly as teaching tools, these things are useful. But yeah, it's, for me, I've always had a problem having it taken seriously. And people always kind of looked at me like it was an unusual thing to do, or this kind of art project. And
Mm-hmm.
you were sort of talking earlier about the richness of this material. I'm going to Chicago going, I just can't believe how amazing this is. And I'm having a hard time, like, convincing people that this is, worth studying in some ways. Like, well, maybe that pawn shops thing was very cool. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but this is pretty neat. So, for me, I couldn't have done a project like the two hip hop projects without extensively using video, and also being able to draw upon that in the writing. I mean, those projects wouldn't have existed without it. At the same time, in 2010, I moved from Chicago to the Middle
Mm-hmm.
East,
Mm-hmm.
and I ended up doing a project there where the camera worked against me
In Qatar.
completely, because it was, it was very invasive to people. The camera was very shocking and confrontational. And it was like, people didn't want to be on camera. They didn't want to be
Right.
videotaped. They wanted nothing to do with it. So the same thing that helped me so much in Chicago worked against me there. It's not the solution for everything, but
that's true.
Certainly, I think that the best projects are visual in some way, even if it's like photography and stuff like that. I like what context does sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I realized too, like, I defend in 2021 my dissertation. So I pretty much collected all of my data up until 2020, right? And I was
Mhm.
lucky in the fact that like COVID didn't really change the trajectory of my project. It just gave me
Yeah.
isolation to go complete the
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
But for folks who are like you know, in my department, and as well as like students who were in my lab that were younger, whereas I could tell them like, hey, this is how I went about this thing. Um, the game sort of changed in the ways in which they could pursue their projects, particularly
Yeah.
those who were looking to do qualitative things. And, I saw creativity come out of that where, even the working group I'm involved with through Rutgers University and Jeff Lane, who, put out a book called The Digital Street. Um, we sort of started working through like what does it mean to do digital ethnography, not necessarily saying everything should be done online, or not necessarily saying uh, that platforms can be the only field site, but really exploring the idea of, hey, if we have these constraints, can we then um, surpass those barriers to learn things about the people that we're studying in ways that maybe we couldn't before. But then also, like, what does that mean if you're DMing a subject, or if you're commenting on Twitter and they respond and there's a dialogue and you use that or quote that, or if you're screenshotting something, or what if, a subject makes a TikTok post that's interesting or posts a YouTube video that's interesting. It's kind of hard to really convey what that is with real context just through the written word. So even in the
Hmm.
idea of, articles being posted with hyperlinks or interstitials and things like that, I'm just thinking that, we're on the precipice of something where I think, especially and even more so with artificial intelligence, that I just think that, I'm all for the creative, the creative process. I mean, given my background, I guess that would be obvious, but I just think that, we always get caught into this thought that we have to do the two for the thing for them and the thing for us. And I just wish that, there was a way to sort of convey just that the thing for us isn't the thing that is lesser than, but that it's just it's something that actually adds to the academic product that we're trying to produce. And I don't know if you, as you said earlier, are able to even do the Devious Minds project without the camera, right? It's kind of hard to uh have
I couldn't
a
have. Yeah, no, but also I couldn't have published that book without having tenure because there's no
mm,
theory in it. So,
mm,
you know what I'm saying? It's like
yeah.
there's just a lot of sort of barriers like that in terms of your methods and in terms of your theory and your approach
Hmm.
and everything else. But yeah, maybe there's a change, but I'll tell you, I feel like I've been having this same conversation for a
Hmm.
long time. When I was an undergraduate, people were saying, "Oh, it's all going to change. Everybody's going to be doing visual, things, video ethnographies, video dissertations," and it's like,
Yeah. Nope.
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen it. And if if you decide that you're going to, sort of take that on and use that as part of your scholarship, unfortunately, it could hurt your career opportunities, and
Mm,
it's unfortunate. So,
yeah.
it's I've just been like, yeah, that's fine.
I'm gonna
I'll
do
do
the
the
thing.
interesting part.
I'm gonna give
Yeah,
you all the thing and then do my
right.
thing and then we'll make
Yeah,
it. I
right.
mean, that's been my
Exactly.
philosophy too. You know what though, but I've had more and more. I mean, I credit maybe it's doing this podcast and being in a journalism school that has
Mm,
also sort of like pushed me in these directions where I think I'm in a building that I think is a little bit more accepting of very public facing scholarship, and
yeah.
that can only be done through stuff like documentaries and things that are a little bit more accessible. Like more just recently, I was a associate producer on a project with the Chicago White Sox, in which we traced the history of the rebrand of the White Sox hat and how it sort
Uh,
of blended with hip hop culture. And I got to live out a lot of my childhood dreams. We interviewed Frank Thomas, Bo
wow.
Jackson, and
Wow.
but then also newer people who adopted it. Chance the Rapper, we interviewed Common, Kiki Palmer, all these people from Chicago or who were associated with Chicago culture. But that was actually more celebrated in my department than, say, like the journal article I just did. And it was more like, oh, okay, this is something we can kind of tell parents that we have professors that are
Yeah.
doing these types of
Yeah.
things. And I think that sort of invigorated me to think more about who I was as an undergrad, because I was a journalism major in undergrad. And so
Yeah. Me too.
the other thing is talking to another guest who was on the podcast recently, A.D. Carson, who's at the University of Virginia, who actually did a rap album as his
Yeah.
dissertation at
Yeah. Yeah.
Clemson,
Yeah.
and now is a professor of hip hop in the School of Music at
Right.
the University of Virginia, and just made tenure. So I'm like, I'm seeing, but you're right though, because even him being able to accomplish putting out a peer-reviewed album, even when he was talking to me about it and saying like you should do one, and I was like, I don't think that could get me tenure. That was my first response, and I was like, you're a professor of hip hop. I think making a hip hop album works for you, right? With that title. But that's not the thing that they're asking me to do here. And I think he set a precedent in that his dissertation was that. I think if you don't set that precedent, they don't know. You know what I mean? If they're hiring the guy that wrote the thing, they're not hiring the guy that raps the thing. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that was key. I thought I was doing something radical by even doing a job talk about Chief Keef. I thought I was doing too much, right? So, it's still kind
Yeah,
of,
I
I
understand.
had some reservations about how I was going to be received. But just because we're running low on time, I want to get back to this Devious Minds project, because I
Yeah.
was so, you know, I mean, it just made me wish I had a camera around more often, or just recorded my thoughts, even as a diary, more often when I was in the midst and in the throes of the pursuit. Because I think you've been able to capture an arc of a group trying to make it. And I think you've been able to also show that there are big wins, big losses, little losses, and you're going to encounter all of those in pursuing trying to be a hip hop artist, particularly if you aren't in one of these like entertainment centers or entertainment hubs. And there's all of these like, you know, almost make it moments that force people to continue to, to strive and have a continuous commitment to trying to make it as a rap artist. And there's a lot of sacrifice that goes into it, a lot of selfishness that goes into it, and you were able to sort of capture the arc of a really long period of time for a very select group of individuals who were able to attain a certain level of attention, um, but not get over the hump, so to speak. Uh, can you talk a little bit about sort of how you shed light here on 20 years of what you call the greatest rap group to almost make it out of Kansas. Like what inspired you to tell the story?
So two things. I mean, one is that I think it's a really universal story, and
Hmm.
as idiosyncratic as it is, and the almost like the deeper I got into the story, the more I felt like it was universal. The more universal it seemed to me. This was everyone's story, which is a story about having dreams that don't materialize and having things that we want that don't come true, or sometimes getting the things that we want and they don't work out like we thought that they were, don't feel like we thought they would. So it's tackling that more common concept, especially when it comes to music. We hear the success stories, but 99% of rappers don't make it, and we almost never hear their stories, but that's the common story. Most of us don't get that, dissertation award or that, whatever it is, whatever it is that we want. So often it's, there would be one winner, but everyone else loses. And we only hear about the story of the name of the winner. And so I felt like it was a universal story. And, but what led me to telling their story was the music. And I loved their music. The second I saw them, to me, they were just very special, they were non-commercial, and I thought that was very interesting. They almost reminded me of punk rock. I grew up around different music scenes and even punk rock and things like that. And it reminded me of this sort of punk rock ethos of like, we're not going to sell out. The lyrics are everything. We don't care if there's a chorus. We're going to rap for 12 minutes straight, and we don't care because we're just in it for the art. And you occasionally meet people like that, but then the music's not that great either. You're like, okay, artist, thanks. Couldn't you just play me a decent song, please? I'd love to hear a catchy chorus in here, but they were amazing performers, and the music was good too. So to me, as somebody who, when you're a music journalist, as I was for so often, so many years, you so often see these, 100 local bands, and none of them are that developed or very good. But when you see a good one, and this happened absolutely in Hustle and Flow too, when you see a group that just has everything, it instantly stands out. And so to me, from the second I saw them, I just thought this was an incredible group. And I thought that they were touring with You God. I thought they were on tour from New York.
Mm-hmm.
When someone told me they were from Topeka, Kansas, I mean, my jaw almost hit the floor. And so we started working together almost immediately from that moment on. As weird as it sounds, we almost instantly made a music video. I had just gotten a camera. I didn't know what I was doing. None of us had ever made a music video before, but we made this music video together, and there was just something magic about it, something that just was great about it. And as we continued to collaborate and work together, there was something about the chemistry with us that just produced, something. I saw something in them, and they trusted me to see it. And I don't know, but somehow we just collaborated for years and years. And I stayed with them, stayed with their story, just because I did love the music, but also I had videotaped all of this stuff. We made a documentary film about them early on, and so I had amassed, so many dozens, hundreds of hours of footage, and so I had all of that footage. I always loved it and thought it was cool and wanted to do something with it, and I kept in touch with them. But there was no question that when I got to Chicago, it was sort of, in some ways, picking up where that project left off, and I always returned to it and continued to look at their live shows. And I just had all of this good footage, and still do. It'd still be neat to do something with that footage because it's amazing. I know so much of it has never been seen.
Super cool. Super cool. I guess, looking ahead, what are some of the things that this is one thing that I've been asking a lot of individuals. What are some of the things that you have been thinking about that, whether you had the time or not to pursue, you hope to read about in the near future?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that it's interesting. Like your work with clout chasing and the movement of these spaces that were so vitally in person moving online. I think that there's a lot of interesting there. And you were talking earlier about, what ethnography might look like during the pandemic or something like that. And to me, it's like people's lives have become so digitized and virtual or something that, to me, there's not even, for so many people, there's not even a separation anymore. And
No,
I'm thinking of like my kids, younger people who've just grown up with this. I mean, it's very unusual now to be somebody who remembered what life was like before the internet existed and before all this stuff. But even things like the smartphone, which came out in 2007, changed things so much.
Yes.
Even in Chicago during that time, having those phones and having a video camera in your phone, that was a total game changer. So to me, I'm interested in like what about these sort of, what is it about these sort of digital lives? I think is interesting. And then also in rap music, I mean, you're seeing a little bit of this, but it's very interesting to me that you now have rappers who are 60, 70, 80 years old, which we didn't have before. And so what does that sort of mean? Because we're familiar with jazz musicians of that age or blues musicians, maybe rock musicians with the Stones and stuff like that. What does it mean when we have rappers who are that age? And what does that mean to them? And what does that mean to young people? And what does that mean to the music itself as it gains that sort of history? To me, that's interesting, and that's a space that's kind of unexplored. Partially because it's like, well, who wants to explore old rappers or something like that? Murray Foreman's done some really cool work on that, and you get some of this with the Devious Minds thing, but. There were a bunch of things like in that project theoretically that I wanted to write about. And I had originally had a lot of theory and had written all this theory and then ended up removing that from there. And some of it was about what it's like to sort of age into or out of your identity as a musician and into something else, or the sort of OG musicians. Which Blowing Up wrote a little bit about, these sort of OG musicians and what does that mean? So there were a bunch of places in there where I was interested in doing theory. The other place, if somebody wants to steal a good theory idea, I've got one for you. And that's that, to me, it's like we talk about the creative class, which are the professionals who get paid to do creative things. But there's this creative underclass as well, who are people like Devious Minds or all of the underground musicians who really develop the new styles and sounds that get then appropriated by the creative class, who then sell it to the mainstream. So it's like, we all know that the underground is where it comes from, but there really is, I think some interesting theorizing around there, because it's the same thing. All of those, Verbal Kent and Rusty Chains and the Typical Cats and all of those wonderful artists in Chicago who didn't make it, they still contributed to the Lupe Fiascos and the Chief Keefs and all. Oh my God, completely contributed to what those artists were then able to take over to the other side and turn into sort of creative class pursuits. So to me, it's the same thing. I'm always interested in the story of the have-nots, the ones who didn't make it, the underground rappers, because so often their story is untold, but also all of that material bubbles up too. So I was going to theorize around, really like, I have to be so careful saying it, but Devious Minds' influence on Tech Nine, and he has been incredibly successful. And they were around at the same time, coming up at the same time, and Tech was certainly ahead of them. But the point is that somebody like Tech Nine, who's been incredibly successful and partially, due to his incredible talent, work ethic, and all of that stuff, like any artist, he takes influences from those around him. And so he gained from all of the work that the others did around him who didn't make it. That includes Devious Minds and many others. This is not unique to him. It's true of all artists, but it's that artist that makes it. It's not just that they had something special. They had something, that was built from the whole community around them. So I think there's something interesting about that sort of creative underclass. And I was going to theorize around that in the Devious Minds book, but ultimately, fortunately, I was able to remove all of that theory and just leave the part that everybody really wants.
I mean, did that sort of, and this is my last question, did that decision to sort of remove the theory, um, at what point during the project did that happen? And I guess, was it a weight that was sort of lifted off your shoulders to do that, or was it just sort of like a creative decision?
Well, with hustle, I always felt that hip hop studies were very under theorized. Like wasn't a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
deep, dense, good, meaty theory in
Yeah.
the hip hop studies.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons you could criticize hip hop studies or music studies in general was
Yep.
the lightness of the theory. And to me, when I wrote Hustle and Flow, I said, I'm going to make this the most theoretical book about rap music that's ever been written. I'm going to cite everything that's ever been done in here. This is going to be just a theory, like I'm going to beat you over the head with the theory. I even said, I'm going to teach you all about social class and the whole thing. And people are like, why is this in here? And I'm like, because I want the theory. And of course, everybody just loved the ethnography. All they talked about was the Bully Boys and the ex-cons and how fun that was. I'm like, what about my great theory? No, nobody cared. So in this book, first of all, I felt like, and this is sort of going back to our earlier conversation, but I felt like, okay, the only way I can get this book published by an academic press is if it's full of a bunch of theory. So
Okay.
I wrote the book as just a straight narrative, almost the book that you see today, but a much lesser version of that. But I basically just said, I'm going to start by writing their story. So I just have their story and I don't have to have the theory get in the way of the story. So then what am I going to do? What am I going to theorize around? And, part of it was I had some ideas that I wanted to do, like a book about fatherhood, for example. I thought it'd be very interesting to talk about their roles as fathers, trying to make it, because I had just become a father. It was really interesting to me that this whole time they had all of this stuff going on with kids and families that I had never considered at all, because I just it wasn't part of my own life. So I was very interested in things like that. But I realized that the book could only be about what was in the interviews from back in the day. So I went back and transcribed all of the videotaped interviews from 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, all of these interviews. And what is in there? Are they talking about fatherhood? They weren't. I wasn't asking about fatherhood. And I was like, I can't do another Hustle and Flow. I can't do another book about a band trying to, they're trying to make it. It has to be about something else, theoretically. But what was in the interviews was about a band trying to make it. That's what the book had to be about. So I was like, that has to be the theory, and that has to be what this is about. So I tried to sort of wedge this theory into the narrative and working in some of these ideas of creative class and stuff like that. And to me, it was a weight and it was terrible, but I felt like this is the only way I can get this done. So I submitted it, and, Columbia University Press had the book. They really liked it. And we're very kind, sent it out to reviewers. Reviewers read it. All the reviewers said this theory is terrible. It's really, undercooked, and you have to have a lot more theory in this book. And it's going to have to, you have to take out all of this narrative stuff and put in more theory. And I'm going, oh man, this is terrible. And I'm in the response to the reviewer comments, I'm going, well, I guess I can add, this or that and add this source. And fortunately, Eric, the editor, said, you ought to just take all of this theory out. If you look at it, like, everywhere you're reading, once you get to the theory part, it's like if you just remove that paragraph, then it would be much better. And I'm like, that's because I stuck it in there. That's why. It read perfectly until I jammed this terrible. But I thought, like, I can't take all the theory out, can I? But literally I did. I took out over 10,000 words of theory from the manuscript. And it was liberating. It was freeing. And also it then gave me the room to do what I felt like needed to be done, which was go interview Carla, their first manager, who was a female manager. I mean, so interesting. And interview Randy, who was their longtime manager, who I had interviewed 20 years ago, but hadn't followed up with, and interview like their original DJ and just some of the original producers and stuff like that. I got to add those other voices to the story instead of this theory. And to me, their voices added so much to the finished manuscript and really transformed it from, I don't know, something that was okay to something that really had a richness that was just missing in that theory part. So that was a great call on the part of the editor to give me the, sort of freedom to do something like that, but also to take the chance on something like that. And, knowing that certainly I did present it at the ethnography workshop with Gary. Of course, Gary's like, where is the theory in this? But, I think ultimately, to me, it's a book where it's really trying to show rather than tell. And so you can, I don't think I have to explain anything to you once you read the book, because it's all there. There's such a trajectory, and you get from childhood to, when these men are now in their early 50s and grandfathers, you get the whole story. And, to me, it's, although I am there, I always try to leave myself out of the book. It was the editor who again said, you need to come in at the end and explain why you wrote this book and what your connection is and what your own background is and what led you to do this. And so that became part of the end of the book too. But, to me, I'm so happy that we were able to do the book this way, and also what that has meant to them, who have spent their whole lives feeling like they weren't recognized and weren't respected. And me, who said, these are brilliant musicians. Right. And you have to first and foremost, that's where it always began with me, was the music. And for me, it's like they now have at least, their book is in libraries around the world. Their story is part of the canon. It's great to see, the Cornells and the Harvards who have the hip hop studies centers now, this research being taken seriously as culture, when we've, again, 25 years ago, it was difficult to even present this at a conference sometimes. Now, you really see how far it's come. And that's really great. And I think it's very cool that there's a recognition that these artists in little micro scenes like Topeka were making a real contribution. And as I say, you see that in the group, where the influence in somebody like Tech Nine, everybody knows Tech Nine. And so, Tech Nine was influenced by groups like this who maybe didn't get the recognition. So it's neat to see these stories become part of it. And for me, it's neat for them, not for me. I'm just honored that I was able to be part of that, any part of that story. Very, very honored.
Awesome, man. This has been wonderful interview. I'm floored just because the thought of even bringing back up all these names from the old days for me are making me feel like nostalgic in my own way. But this has definitely taken a lot of directions and turns that have inspired me and have my wheels and gears turning as well on things that I'm working on currently. And again, I just want to extend to you, if you ever need anything from me on the other end, I would be glad to show up and talk to a class or whatever, virtually or however. And, best of luck to you in all of your endeavors and in fatherhood. I have a teenager who's sitting about 10 feet from me. So, I know how that can go and where it leads.
The real work.
But thank you again. Thank you again, Geoff.
Thank you, man.
I appreciate you.
Great pleasure. I appreciate you so much. This was a real honor for me. So thank you.
Awesome. It's another episode of Uncommon Knowledge. I'm your host, Dr. Jabari Evans. Peace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at Naledge Since 82. and on Twitter at Knowledge Since 82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's Naledge, since 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.